We'd like to thank GoDaddy, our sponsor for our podcast from Node.js Interactive in Austin, Texas. You may know GoDaddy as a hosting company, but they also have a deep involvement in the Node.js ecosystem. You can learn more at GoDaddy.com. That's GoDaddy.com. GoDaddy.com. Hey, it's Alex Williams of the New Stack here at Node.js Interactive in Austin, and I'm here with Charlie Robbins of GoDaddy. Hey, Charlie.
Hey, Alex, how you doing?
Great. I'm really interested in talking with you. We just were having a little chat before, we started recording, and I'm really interested in this whole concept of really scale, and it's an emphasis for us at the New Stack, and a lot of it comes down to how do you actually do it, right? And how do you decouple? You said this very clearly. How do you decouple the front end from the back end? And you've been working on a project called Warehouse.ai, and you're now just starting to talk about it. Can you tell us what that is? And
Sure.
Then we can go from there.
Absolutely. So Warehouse.ai is a front-end operations system that we built at GoDaddy to decouple our front-end deployments from our back-end. So if you think about your typical Node.js app, you are going to have this web server that is also serving all of your static assets. So your JavaScript, your CSS, your HTML is going to come from that same web server. That means that anytime you want to deploy, say, a CSS fix, that has to also deploy your web server. And that process might be much more involved than just, say, pushing a few files to a CDN. So our goal is to make that as easy as possible and as structured as possible based on a developer tool that people are already pretty familiar with, which is NPM.
So tell us about what are the drivers that brought you to this point, like decoupling the front end to the back end. We're talking, if you think about the overall kind of workflows that people have, there's much quicker delivery right now. The deployments are a lot faster, right?
Yep.
And so this almost like, if you're going to have faster deployments, you're going to need new ways to deploy without having to kind of, with the you need to find ways to deploy without the computational challenges that you would if you had to do it the old way.
Right. There's a lot of upstream dependencies that you might have in your server deploy. You might be using Kubernetes, you might be using Console, you might be using some sort of Docker Swarm thing, and that team that's administering that might be kind of different than your front-end team. Depending on the scale of your team, like the human scale, you might end up with a large front-end team and a large back-end team, and oftentimes the front-end devs are dependent on back-end devs to deployments. That's not the case at GoDaddy. My team actually deploys both, but we knew over time that as we grew the front-end team, we needed them to own their own deployments. And they were already really familiar with NPM, and so were we through the work that we'd done at Nodejitsu before we were at GoDaddy. So building out a deployment system based on NPM specifically for front-end assets made a lot of sense.
So your team then, deploys both, right? So tell us then what that allowed you to do by having that. But what does it allow you to do, with the fact that your team does deploy both?
Sure. The real motivation for the system at GoDaddy was what my team does. So I'm the engineering director for the UX platform team. We build out the shared user experience infrastructure for every product team at GoDaddy. So we work with, I think, north of 50 teams. And all those teams, we want them to use the same version of the asset. So they all make integrations with us. They all need to say, okay, at runtime, what script tags, what CSS link tags should I be including on my page? Previously, that had been sort of a manual configuration process. Now it's all automated with Warehouse. So these 50 teams, they make a request to us every 15 minutes. If we've done a deployment, they're going to get their asset right away. And at that scale, that makes our lives so much easier because we can just publish something, tag it as production, and it's just out. We don't have to worry about any other steps of the deployment process.
Okay, so take us through then what actually Warehouse actually does. Tell us, can you do kind of a real explanation of it?
So it's fronted by a proxy that understands the NPM wire protocol. So underneath the covers, if you've ever run npm with, say, log level info, you'll see it makes a get, it makes a put, it makes a post. The publish is actually a put, and that put has a JSON payload that contains your actual tarball, the thing you're trying to put into the npm registry. We receive that and ship it off to a build service that runs npm install and runs whatever web builder you might use, whether that be Webpack or Browserify or Babel, and then puts that into a CDN, something that's S3 compatible. And then from there, it updates the metadata so that when you say, hey, Warehouse, like, what should I be including if I want to run in prod? It says, oh, you should use these script tags and these link tags, which I've already included.
How does it know that?
So when it's actually responsible for building those assets, and since it's uploading it to your S3 compatible place, it's going to get a location back from S3 that says, oh, this is where those URLs are. This is where your CDN is. So you've got a CDN configured. You've put the assets into the thing that's backing your CDN. So you know that URL by definition because you've configured the state of your environment in that way. The other nice thing that it does is that, let's say that you have to build for different locales. At GoDaddy, we run in over 38 different languages. So that means every deployment for us is actually 38 deployments to all different languages, and that's all handled automatically by this system.
Okay, so why do you guys call it Warehouse?
It just seemed like a good name. You know, you're sort of clearinghouse for your front-end code.
So tell us now about how you're using this on a day-to-day basis, or how you're starting to use it on a day-to-day basis.
So my team owns, among other things, the sort of shared control set and also the shared headers. So like if you use any GoDaddy product, you'll see the sort of shared navigation that they all get. Those teams have to get that from us. And when they do that, the system that gets that queries Warehouse and says, hey, well, what version of the header is in production? What version of the control set is in production? And then it just pulls those down, ships them back to one of the product teams. That ends up in an HTML page that gets served out to a GoDaddy customer.
So is this going to be available now to really anyone?
Yeah, we open sourced it today.
Okay.
Went out this morning. We would love to, anyone and everyone to run it. That's sort of our first goal, is to make running it sort of a push button thing so that someone can spin it up and run it, say, on GoDaddy or on Google Cloud or wherever. And that's mainly because we're not planning to run this sort of as a publicly available service, where it's mainly a piece of software that we put out that other people could run if they want to.
Okay. So tell us then, what are some of the you have your own use case for it. What are some other use cases?
There's some really interesting
Yeah.
use cases, actually, that I've thought of that I've never done. There's a big movement towards, say, like AWS Lambda, right? And Lambda is JavaScript. And if you're going to do anything complicated with Lambda, you have to run a build. You have to actually compile everything sort of like Webpack into a single file. So that today there's a bunch of deployment tools for that. But if you, say, had Warehouse configured to run like your Lambda build and then had it shove it into Lambda instead of in S3, that could be a really interesting use case for it.
Because Lambda would allow what?
So Lambda is serverless computing.
Right.
So it only wants, you ship it a file and it runs that file, and then it can ship it off to other files. So because of that, you have this sort of dependency tree of pieces. And one of the features of Warehouse is that if you depend on a module and that module is published, it'll trigger an upstream build. So if you have this Lambda chain of all these small functions that need to each get compiled, if you say compile the base one, it would trigger a redeploy of all of it. So you could see how doing serverless computing might be a little bit easier that way. It's one of my theories, anyway.
That's interesting, because the premise behind Warehouse is to manage to manage that module, really.
Right, manage the build process for that module.
Yeah.
Anything that has to take a bunch of JavaScript and turn it into one file and ship that file somewhere, that's sort of what we're trying to
And then
build a process
Lambda
for.
would allow you then to be able to program it, really,
Right.
and then automate that whole process.
Right, Warehouse could automate your Lambda deployment process for you.
Right. And then Lambda can then take it in
Right, and then it's
And-
just running whatever you wanted it to run.
like a function, right?
Yep.
Yeah, and so that's pretty interesting. With this Warehouse.ai, where do you guys want to go with it? What are some of the next? What are your thinking about where you take it next?
So we've got some interesting features that we want to build out. One of the big challenges for the system right now is the atomicness of deploys. And so when you actually move something, you can promote things through different environments, right? When you publish something, it automatically goes into dev. So it doesn't go straight into prod, which is one of the nice things. And you can say then tag that as prod. When you tag it, it actually triggers a new build. That shouldn't trigger a new build because there is a very tiny chance that something might have changed underneath the covers, if you're not using shrink wrap anyway. So we want those things to be sort of immutable assets. You run a build that is the version that exists forever, and then you can promote that thing. The automated upstream triggering of builds that I mentioned today actually would put something automatically into production for you. That works for us. We think that we're gonna wait on feedback for it, but we have a hypothesis that that's a little bit too scary for most people. And so instead of it automatically putting something in production, we want it to sort of trigger a canary build, like, hey, I've built this for you because your downstream modules have changed. Would you like to promote this? Sort of like Greenkeeper does.
So I think about security in this whole kind of process, and what is your context about testing and making sure that that these are modules that you would be that you trust, right? And or is that a separate process entirely that is predicated on then using Warehouse?
So there's I didn't actually get enough time to talk about this in my session today, but one of the things we've built is a check system. So because we have the tarball asset, when you publish it, it actually is your module. We untar that thing in memory, and you can configure Warehouse to run any arbitrary checks. So if you wanted to say, write a check that said, hey, you have to depend on React 15.3, like, cool, then if your module doesn't depend on React 15.3, it's actually going to reject that publish, sort of like a git post-receive hook. If you wanted to say, hey, run a check to make sure that all the things in your package.json are safe and all the transient dependencies are safe, you could do that there. These are things we're not doing today, but you could easily configure the system to do.
So how do you guys do it at GoDaddy? How do you think about security with when you're using these modules and using JavaScript and Node?
So we run some regression analysis against the Node security project. We almost read every line of code that we put into production. We're a little bit old school like that. There's a saying that I like to quote, which is that by using some open source project, you are implicitly saying one day that you are agreeing to maintain it if the author decides that they don't want to maintain it anymore. Right. Most people don't end up there, but I've been on that other side of the fence a few times. Like, module author walks away from writing something, you're now on the hook to make sure that that thing stays up to date. So every time you take a dependency, you should be looking under the covers, seeing what's going on, having some sense of confidence if it's a good thing that you should be running or not.
Great. So are there new open source projects now that you guys are going to be working on?
I think we're going to keep working on these for a while.
Yeah.
They're pretty interesting to us. We've got a lot of interesting use cases for them at GoDaddy, and we're working towards having more teams adopt this system internally at GoDaddy, which is pretty exciting.
Excellent. Charlie, thank you very much for taking the time.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. I hope you have a great day.
It was a lot of fun. Thanks.
Absolutely.
We'd like to thank GoDaddy, our sponsor for our podcast from Node.js Interactive in Austin, Texas. You may know GoDaddy as a hosting company, but they also have a deep involvement in the Node.js ecosystem. You can learn more at GoDaddy.com. That's GoDaddy.com. GoDaddy.com.